This is an update on the Air India crash flight 171. Yesterday I saw a video that had some outrageous accusations, in my opinion, and basically they're implying that the crash was deliberate by one or both of the pilots. This video is based on an article on strikeengine.com. All the sources and links are in that article, and the article is linked to from the video description. So in the article I've said one of the most prominent YouTube aviation channels has released a new Air India air crash video, and this time they seem to be sure, at least that's my interpretation of their video, that they know what happened to Air India 171. And apparently the fuel control switches were set to cut off, and with this sliver of information, this supposed pilot and YouTube aviation expert feels sure enough to blame both or one of the pilots for the accident. In this video I'm going to explain why the position of the fuel cutoff switches indicates precisely nothing. Fortunately, it's not going to take too long. If we go to 787.weebly.com, apparently it's a technical site for pilots, and on this website they have a list of memory actions, memory item checklists which pilots should know from memory, so they do not need to get out the physical checklist. And on the memory item checklist for the 787 is a section dealing with the fuel control switches, and what it says is this. It's very short. For a dual engine failure or stall, first step, fuel control switches both cut off in the cut off position and then run, and then ram air turbine switch, push and hold for 1 second. So that is what it says in the memory item checklist. And there's a link here to a video which goes through that procedure quickly. In my last article I explained why the loss of thrust from both engines was the most likely explanation for the crash, and in this scenario you would expect, if the pilots followed the checklist, to actually see the fuel control switch in either the cut off or the run position, because that is the procedure, to put it into cut off and then to run. If the flight happened to come to an end when the switch was in the cut-off position, to me at least, it means precisely nothing with regards to the state of mind of either of the pilots, i.e. did they want to murder everybody on that flight. In my opinion, the only thing I think we can imply with the information that we have, i.e. that the switches were in the cut-off position, if indeed they were, is that the pilots were going through the checklist and trying to save the aircraft, i.e. trying to restart the engines, as that is what says in the procedure. And the fact that the RAT was deployed, to me again, is further evidence that the procedure was being followed, because it does say in the procedure to activate the ram air turbine. Unfortunately, this YouTube expert has somehow come to the conclusion that one or both of the pilots was suicidal because of the position of the fuel control switch. I dive into it a bit more here on the fuel control switches on the 787. So this is a screenshot of that website. It's a Sky High Tech's knowledge base. I'm assuming this is an accurate source of information, and it gives the procedures for engine restart. I'm going to quote what it says. Memory items should be carried out. Fuel control switch cut off. Allow the restart sequence to run until the engine auto restart message displays. And then it continues. Note for in-flight starts, the auto system discontinues the start temporarily only if the exhaust gas temperature between start and takeoff EGT is reached, or a hung start is detected. Auto start takes corrective action if some start problems are detected, but does not abort the start in mid-flight. So if I'm reading this correctly, and if the source is accurate, the pilots may have had to wait for the auto engine restart message to display, which again would be yet another reason, another sign that the pilots were following procedure with the full fuel control switch in the cut-off position. However, there does appear to be some contradiction between these two sources. And that is in the way the auto start functions on the ground and how it functions in the air. On the ground, I'm going to assume that means wait for this message to appear, and I assume there's no delay in flight because of this video. So as a layman, if the auto start function works differently on the ground versus in the air, that would seem potentially confusing to me, especially in a stressful situation. So that's the fuel switches. Then we come on to the cockpit warning. And for me, this is another thing that discounts the YouTube experts' theory that a pilot flew the plane into the ground deliberately. And this is the cockpit, and this is due to the cockpit displaying a message that the fuel control switches have been set to an unusual position. So this is a 787 cockpit apparently, and the main screen in the center, I think it's called ICAS, and this will, if the fuel control switches has been put to an unusual position, this will show that they are in an unusual position. So you've got the one seat here, the other seat's over here. This is the central display. So in short, if one of the pilots had put the fuel control switches into cutoff, then both pilots should have been aware of the situation, given that this is a memory item. The first thing to check is the fuel cutoff switches. So I'm not sure how the expert explains this, i.e. how the fuel control switches can be in the cutoff position and both pilots not being aware of the situation. And going by his theory, like one of the pilots was suicidal and they wanted to fly the plane into the ground, would the other pilot have not have tried to put the switch back to run if the other pilot was acting outside procedure? And if the expert's theory is correct, i.e. that one of the pilots deliberately flew the plane in the ground, would there not have been some sort of scuffle in the cabin? And if there were a scuffle, how do we explain the steady movement of the plane during the scuffle, i.e. that plane flew smoothly until it ran into the ground? In short, if the source is correct, either both pilots flew the plane into the ground or they were actually following procedure for the loss of two engines. Personally, I think following procedure is by far the most likely explanation, which leaves us where? Let me summarise all the points I've made so far. First, a prominent YouTube aviation expert is stating that they believe the plane was deliberately flown in the ground, solely based on the position of the fuel control switches. Second, the fuel control switches being in the cut-off position appears to be completely in keeping with procedure in a situation where both engines have lost power. Third, the RAT is deployed, which reinforces the thought that the pilots are following procedure in a situation where both engines lost power. And fourth, there is a warning in the cockpit shown on the center screen, which informs both pilots that fuel control switches have been switched to the cut-off position. Fifth, there appears to be no physical alternation in the cockpit to rectify the situation. Taking all these points into consideration, I see no basis to believe that either of the pilots deliberately crashed this airplane. All the actions that we know about appear to be completely in keeping with procedure when facing complete loss of thrust from both engines. Let's move on to the RAT quickly, the ram air turbine. Specifically, under what conditions does the RAT deploy? So Aviation Stack Exchange has a post on just this subject. I've linked to it in the article there. Basically what it says is there are only two ways the RAT is deployed: either manually by the pilots, i.e. part of the engine restart procedure, or automatically due to a catastrophic failure on the aeroplane. Like the aeroplane will detect that there has been some issue, which has been detailed here, i.e. both engines have failed, center system pressure is low, both AC transfer buses are underpowered, or all three hydraulic system pressures are low. In that case, the airplane will automatically deploy the RAT. Whichever the reason for the RAT deployment on Air India Flight 171, neither jives with the behaviour of pilots wanted to crash the plane, in my opinion. In short, the RAT is yet another argument against pilot error or malicious intent. The YouTube expert, I believe, in my opinion and my interpretation, hints that the deployment was far too quick to be done manually if a pilot had not planned it in advance. But I would counter, if the pilot deployed the RAT, why would that lead the expert to believe that the pilot wanted to bring the plane down? To bring it to a close, let's look at the flight path of Air India 171. As far as I'm concerned, and assuming the sources I'm quoting are accurate, I see no reason to believe there was a pilot error, and much less a pilot deliberately crashing a plane. But maybe the flight path of Air India 171 tells a different story. Did the plane fly into a residential area to maximise casualties on the ground? So here are two pictures from newspapers which show the flight path and the Air India crash site. So we've got one here from cbc.ca, and we've got here from theprint.in. While the flight path from both photos vary slightly, this one slightly different at this one, we can see that the plane flew over a residential area before it crashed. So this is the airport, a lot of houses here, and then it crashes here or in this area here, basically areas where arguably there's less people than there is here. So for me, there's no evidence of a pilot or pilots deliberately trying to kill people, and actually it's the opposite. If anything, the pilot is trying to avoid killing people on the ground as much as possible. So summary, Air India crash and the fuel control cut-off hypothesis. I probably laboured the point, but based on the evidence and the sources in this article, I find any accusation or implication that the Air India pilots deliberately crashed the plane to be completely and utterly baseless. There is simply no evidence that the pilots acted any way that was counter to procedure. And using the sources I've linked to in this article, in the previous article here, again link in the article, my personal opinion as a layman is the same. To me, it appears there was a catastrophic failure on the plane that led to both engines losing thrust, and that the pilots did what little they could to limit the loss of life. This is not to say the aviation expert is wrong. It's simply that I don't think the evidence that he presents and in the information in this article and the sources in this article, I don't think there's any reason to imply that the actions of the pilots caused the Air India flight 171 crash deliberately or otherwise. So guys, that's the Air India update from me. If you want to see more videos like this, if I do any more on the Air India, obviously subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. If you've got time, hit the like button, look after yourselves, and I'll see you again next time.